Today, we're going to talk largely about that poster of Uncle Sam saying, "I want you." Your book, as I mentioned, is called Uncle Sam Wants You. And we're going to talk about what it represents, which is much more than just a poster. But to start off, maybe we should just begin with the poster. So when and where does it come from? I mean, everybody knows. My listeners are, I think the minority are American at this point, maybe like 40% or something. But still, most people are probably familiar with the Uncle Sam poster, at least from the media.
Right. So I think, from what I understand, this image, which is of Uncle Sam, right, kind of figure of sort of American culture, pointing out at the viewer with the words "I want you," is one of the most recognizable images of the United States, not only in America but around the world, right? And you can go to sort of any continent in the world, and it will be recognized by people, often used by them in cartoons and graffiti. So even if your listeners are not from the United States, this is an image that they know, and it has a history, right? And I wanted to kind of start by recovering that history, but I also wanted to ask what that history might show us about America, right? And particularly America in the moment of World War I, which is when it was made. So it actually exists in multiple forms. It actually, the story, and the story I think is pretty accurate, right? We'll never know for sure. Is the image was drawn by an artist, James Montgomery Flagg, who was a graphic artist, very well known in the United States in the 1910s, very successful illustrator. And he had a contract to design a magazine cover for a magazine called Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper, which was a sort of weekly, light illustrated magazine. And as the story goes, Flagg had no idea what to do. He had no ideas. But so he just sort of, kind of retooled an image that already existed. And he would have been familiar for sure with a British military recruiting poster that was first produced in 1914 by the British artist Alfred Leet. Now, this poster has almost the exact same format. It has sort of a individual pointing at the viewer. In this case, it says, "Your country needs you," and that image circulated widely in Britain. It was definitely reprinted, circulated in the United States. Flagg would have known it. Basically, what he did is he used that and a mirror. Right, and he basically took sort of a self-portrait of himself, aged himself a little bit, and generated Uncle Sam. Right, and at first this image appeared in 1916 on the magazine cover, right, and it was sort of the cover at the time said, "What are you doing for preparedness?" Preparedness was a kind of popular movement, a volunteer movement that advocated that the United States should get more involved in World War I, should get ready to be in the war. Right at this point, it's 1916. The war's been going on in Europe for 2 years. The United States is not officially part of the war. Okay, and then, by all accounts, that then the magazine article is forgotten. The magazine cover, sort of drops off the face of the earth. But a year later, the U.S. enters the war, right? And at that point, Flagg volunteers to support the war. He repurposes this image into a U.S. military recruiting poster, specifically for the Army. And that's where it gets its famous caption, "I want you," right? And inviting Americans to in that case, to join the U.S. military.
So I didn't realize that it was such a well-known image. I mean, it makes sense when you explain it that it's probably up there with the American flag or George Washington, maybe even better known than George Washington. I wouldn't be surprised if many foreign people think it's George Washington now that I think about it. But I know the image too, but just a few paragraphs of the book was enough to tell me that I had never really looked at the image or thought so much about it. And when you look at it keeping in mind that it is a piece of art made by a very successful and skilled artist. And then when you look at it from the perspective of a historian, you have to take the attitude that Flag had a purpose and you can't really consider anything about it accidental. Everything needs to be analyzed. And one of the things that you pointed out that I had never noticed is that he is dressed in a very funny way, and he's got very disheveled clothing. I'd never really thought much about his really silly top hat with the star on it, but even for the times, I don't think people would be dressed like that. So I wonder, like, what you make of how he's put together in this image and what it's supposed to represent.
Yeah, I think, as with any image, right? The longer you spend with it, the more you see, right? And I think even just the details of his look, the look on his face, for example, right? Which is stern, but not quite as menacing, right? And especially if you compare it to the British recruiting poster, which definitely, is a much more sort of formal pose in that case, right? And this Uncle Sam is, sort of at a slight angle, and I think it really matters that his suit doesn't seem to quite fit the funny top hat. Now, some of that is American visual cultural traditions, right? Images of Uncle Sam had existed for decades before this, right?
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes, but they didn't ever quite look like this. Sometimes he was, tall or short, usually gray-haired, sometimes really quite, sort of stocky, portly kind of figure. But the image that Flag drew has a kind of an informality, and I kind of take that as a way that Flag is conveying, tapping almost into America's Minuteman tradition, right? Of kind of that we don't have at least until the 1910s, we didn't have a standing army, right, of any size, of significant size. We had a kind of volunteer military tradition. We had a sense that coming out of the American Revolution, that of a sort of scrappy underdog sort of fighters, and I think Flag is pointing to that. This is a guy who just sort of almost rolled out of bed when he heard the alarm, and is ready to join the fight.
Yeah, I pulled up the image so that I could look at it because I haven't spent as much time with it as you have. But when I look at the picture now, I totally see that very stern face. But when I look at his face, not only does his hair kind of remind, even though it's coming out from under the hat, it kind of reminds me of like George Washington hair, something like that. But he kind of has an Andrew Jackson look to me. And I don't know how popular Andrew Jackson was at the time, but my guess, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, here's my hunch. My hunch, because I just talked to Jeremy Suri about the American presidency, is that Andrew Jackson was the first Democrat. And even though today he is certainly not popular, he had by many measures a very successful presidency, and he represented this sort of swashbuckling frontiersman attitude that maybe people associate with the American dream. And I'm wondering if that might be at all what Flag was trying to capture by drawing him in this way.
I think, yeah, that certainly could be, right. And, not only, it may not be specifically Andrew Jackson, but certainly a kind of, kind of populist, sort of, kind of almost a community father kind of figure, right? That, many communities across the country would have had people who look like this Uncle Sam character, playing crucial roles in local government or local affairs. And I think that Flag is definitely trying to kind of put a face on this war effort. And on the other side, I think for people who are seeing this image, right, they are seeing something much more amenable to them than than any kind of menacing image of federal bureaucrats in Washington.
You say that he puts a face on it, and when you say it, I'm assuming you're talking about the state or Washington, to use the word that you just mentioned. And it clearly worked, because when you write rhetorically, you write about Uncle Sam like he's a person, saying Uncle Sam wanted this or that or needed such and such. So am I right that that's how you conceive of Uncle Sam, as what he represented? That he wasn't just Washington, but he was the military. He was just all these sorts of things combined in one for people. Because the poster says, "I want you for U.S. Army, nearest recruiting station," but my understanding is that the image was appropriated to all sorts of different contexts. So, I want you for the neighborhood watch, or I want you for the garment factory, things like this.
Yeah, I mean, it could be repurposed. It was used particularly to sell Liberty bonds, that sort of Liberty loan that raised money for the war effort, or sort of in service of the surveillance state as it was emerging, asking people to keep an eye on potential enemy aliens or seditionists of various kinds. So in that sense, Uncle Sam is a stand-in for all kinds of federal power, and to me, I think that's made sense to a lot of people 100 years ago, because federal power was often experienced in very local ways, right? Through individual relationships with people doing the work of the war effort. In their local communities, sometimes with sort of federal badges on their lapels, and sometimes without.
Well, there are a couple more things I want to talk about with Uncle Sam, and then we'll get more to the. I know, even though the book is titled Uncle Sam Wants You, it's not like Uncle Sam is just the entire focus of the book. So we'll get to political obligation. But one thing I'm very curious about is his relation to propaganda in general. So I've done very little reading about propaganda, but I know that it is a massive subject. I mean, for historians, philosophers, political theorists, artists. So it's a huge category. But what I'm wondering is how, as an historian, you think of propaganda, what it is, and where Uncle Sam fits into this.
Right. So, the fact of the matter is, right, that Uncle Sam is firmly an act of propaganda, right? This is an image produced by the federal government in order to generate both political emotion and civic action, right? And I think you can debate the details of the definition of propaganda, but those two elements are really part of it, right? That it's coming from an official entity, and that it's using emotion to generate action. That said, Americans during the First World War and for most of our history have tended to imagine that we don't do propaganda, right? And in fact, the U.S. government during the First World War established an entity called the Committee on Public Information, specifically named that so that it would sound like it wasn't a propaganda agency. But it was. It was doing all that work every day. So this Uncle Sam image, in its first use, is designed to motivate you to join the U.S. Army. But it is part of a broader campaign across the U.S. government during the war to generate emotion and provoke action. And this is an official government policy. It's tapping into the emerging mass media entities, right? We don't have radio yet, but there's film, there's sheet music, there's sort of some popular press, there's illustrated press, there's all kinds of ways in which people's emotions and actions are tapped.
One field that I didn't mention that is also connected in various ways to propaganda, or the study of propaganda, or at least because I don't actually have any experience in this, I'm assuming it does, is psychology. And so I'm wondering if you've read much about the psychology of propaganda and these sorts of images, because right now I'm thinking of this very famous psychology experiment that I'm pretty sure has been replicated, and at least I really hope it's not one of these exemplar studies that haven't been replicable in the replication crisis. But what I'm thinking of is a picture of eyes or a face or something like that is posted over some sort of donation jar. And if there's a face there, rather than say like a vase of flowers, people are much more likely to donate. And again, when I look at this image, I see so many features that would make this successful propaganda. So having the eyes on you and really looking at you menacingly, in a sense, as if it's kind of like being put on the, you don't want to be put on the naughty list, and having that finger pointed at you. I just spoke with a psychologist at Cornell, David Pizarro, about social ostracism. I think that's how it should be pronounced. And it is really deep in our, so to speak, lizard brain that we do not want to be othered or singled out, or isolated. And when you see this, I mean, you just have the sense that everybody's looking at you. And then also, one of the effects that you talk about in the book is that everybody knows that everybody else has seen this image. Everybody knows that the United States needs soldiers for World War One. So it's just very effective in all these different dimensions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's you've hit the nail on the head, right? So part of it, and the thing I think people turn to first is the sense of surveillance, right? That Uncle Sam is watching, right? And in many instances, when the image has been reused in the 20th century, it is to tap into that element of it, right? So, sort of critics of the Patriot Act, critics of sort of the FBI often will use that this image of Uncle Sam, but to convey, that this is a menacing surveillance state who was watching you, and that's absolutely part of it. But I think it's important for us to imagine, what happens on the other end of this poster, particularly in 1917 when the U.S. is entering the war. And it's less about sort of that one-to-one relationship between the federal government and the person being pointed at, but the way in which all Americans are being pointed at by Uncle Sam, right? And the importance, like you just said, of knowing what everybody else knows about our obligations during wartime, right? And that turns out, I think, to be really crucial for how the U.S. actually mobilizes for war.